Tandy's temporarily closing several of its plants across Canada and Mexico. We have waited too many years, actually 15 years, to get back what they promised. We have lives, and while you continue to still get paid, we have families, and you need to get it fixed. In less than 2 months, the heartbeat of American industry has begun to falter. Once busy factories tied for generations to steady Canadian orders now stand in silence, their workers staring down a future no one expected, a trade relationship that shaped entire towns, fed countless households, and anchored the economy for decades is unraveling almost overnight. Canada, long the closest partner and most reliable customer, has turned away, redrawing its supply lines and leaving the United States outside the gates. What drove this sudden break, and how deep will the damage cut? More importantly, is this only the beginning of a much larger shift that could rewrite the balance of power across North America? The unraveling began quietly, hidden in trade negotiations that appeared routine. Canada announced a sweeping plan to redesign its supply chain, signing new trade agreements with Europe, Asia, and South America. At first, it sounded like diversification, a way to hedge against global uncertainty, but the impact has been far more disruptive. One by one, contracts that once flowed seamlessly into American factories were canceled or redirected. What remained was a void that no alternative market could quickly replace. For decades, the United States supplied Canada with the lifeblood of its industry. Automobiles rolled off Ontario assembly lines powered by engines and components from Michigan and Ohio. Construction projects across Canadian cities use American steel and aluminum. Furniture, machinery, and processed foods cross the border daily, linking the economy so tightly that separation seemed unthinkable. That perception has collapsed. The Canadian government framed its decision in clear terms: reduce reliance on U.S. supplies, diversify risk, and strengthen domestic manufacturing. Behind that vision lies a decade of tension. American tariffs on Canadian steel, lumber, and dairy products left deep scars in Ottawa's calculations. Political shifts in Washington repeatedly altered trade policy, creating volatility for businesses that needed consistency. Add to that the higher cost of American labor, energy, and corporate taxes, and the case for change grew undeniable. The execution of this plan has been swift. In Europe, Canada found new partners for industrial machinery, mining equipment, and advanced technologies. Germany, Italy, and France quickly filled gaps once held by American firms. In Asia, deals with Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam delivered auto parts and precision products at prices 15 to 20% lower than those from U.S. suppliers. From South America, raw metals and semi-finished goods poured in, giving Canadian factories cheaper inputs for their production lines. To lock these changes in place, Ottawa imposed stricter requirements on certificates of origin and production standards, creating new hurdles for American companies that had grown accustomed to easier trade across the border. Alongside this, Canadian factories themselves were given subsidies and government contracts, ensuring that local producers stood first in line. The result has been devastating for U.S. exporters. In less than 60 days, contracts worth tens of millions of dollars were canceled. Many factories that once counted Canada as their largest customer have been left with empty order books and no time to find replacements. The losses have not been spread evenly. Certain industries are bearing the brunt. The auto sector is among the hardest hit. Ontario's plants, once heavily dependent on American-made Engines, transmissions, and mechanical parts have shifted to Asian and European suppliers. Factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, which for years kept Canadian assembly lines running, are now reporting revenue losses of 30 to 50%. Dozens of parts manufacturers have already begun furloughing workers, rotating shifts, or closing production lines. The domino effect stretches into trucking, warehousing, and maintenance, spreading the downturn far beyond the factory walls. The steel and metal industries are facing a similar collapse. For years, Canadian demand absorbed large volumes of U.S. sheet steel, structural components, and aluminum products. That demand has now been rerouted to Europe and South America, where prices are lower. In Pennsylvania and Illinois, mills are watching inventories climb and domestic prices fall by as much as 15%. Plants that once thrived on steady cross-border shipments are cutting shifts, while thousands of steel workers are bracing for layoffs. For communities already struggling with decades of industrial decline, the sudden blow could trigger localized recessions. Wood and furniture producers are not immune either. Canadian construction projects once relied heavily on timber from Washington, Oregon, and North Carolina, while furniture buyers favored American-made designs. Today, Scandinavian suppliers, Russian timber firms, and Southeast Asia manufacturers are taking their place. As imports from the United States shrink, many American plants have reduced production by 20 to 40%. Towns where the wood industry formed the backbone of local economies are now watching incomes fall, wages drop, and uncertainty spread through households. The machinery sector tells another chapter in the same story. Canada previously imported tractors, harvesters, mining rigs, and processing lines from American firms. Now those contracts are going to German, Italian, and Japanese companies. The fallout has been sharp. Some U.S. manufacturers have lost up to a third of their export revenue to Canada. For small and mid-size producers, the loss of such a large buyer is existential, forcing layoffs, downsizing, and in some cases, complete shutdowns. Even the food industry, often shielded from the sharp edges of global competition, is facing disruption. Processed foods, beverages, and packaged goods once flowed smoothly into Canadian supermarkets. Now, technical barriers demand costly new certifications, raising expenses for U.S. producers by 15 to 20%. In response, Canadian retailers are importing more from Europe and Australia while investing in their own domestic supply. American food processors are cutting production, which in turn squeezes the farmers who provide their raw ingredients. The ripple continues outward, touching transporters, warehouse workers, and even advertising firms linked to the trade. What ties all of these industries together is the chain reaction set off by Canada's restructuring. When contracts disappear, factories scale down. When factories scale down, suppliers receive fewer orders. Truckers, freight companies, and repair shops lose business. Local diners and stores that once relied on workers' wages feel the downturn as well. In dozens of towns across the Midwest and Rust Belt, the mood has shifted. Streets that once echoed with the hum of steady work are now quieter, weighed down by the prospect of layoffs and closures. Canada's decision is not about one sector, one region, or one set of products. It is a deliberate shift in national strategy executed with speed and precision. The consequences reach beyond economics into the political and social fabric of America's industrial heartland. Communities that built their identity on steady cross-border trade now find themselves exposed, uncertain about whether new markets can ever fill the Gap. What makes this moment so pivotal is not simply the scale of immediate losses, but the precedent it sets. Canada was long considered the safest partner for U.S. industry, a neighbor bound by geography, culture, and decades of shared economic growth. If even this partnership can be rewritten so abruptly, the question arises of how stable America's other trade relationships truly are. For American workers and companies, the realization is dawning that the ground beneath them may be less secure than it seemed. The loss of more than 300 American factories tied to Canadian export contracts represents the unraveling of a lifeline that connected production lines, workers, and local communities for decades. As contracts vanish, factory managers are freezing output, cutting capacity by as much as 30 to 60%, and in some cases shutting doors completely. Without the steady stream of Canadian orders, many plants can no longer cover the weight of operating costs. Revenues fall, loans and insurance premiums become crushing, and maintenance bills pile up with no new business to offset them. Behind the gates, the human impact is no less severe. Workers are losing jobs, shifts are being cut and furloughed. Rotations are becoming the new normal for households that depended entirely on wages from these factories. The sudden loss of income is devastating. Rent, payments, utilities, and loan installments grow impossible to manage. Families slash spending overnight, and that strain spreads quickly to local shops, diners, and small businesses that once thrived on worker paychecks. Raw material suppliers face their own collapse. Farmers who once sold to processing plants are now without buyers. Component makers and packaging companies that relied on factory contracts are watching orders disappear, leaving them with unsold inventories and mounting debt. Bankruptcy is no longer a distant risk, but an immediate reality for many small and mid-sized enterprises.